Like many young, aspiring martial artists, Jason David Frank idolized Jean-Claude Van Damme growing up. So, what exactly the hell happened? How did this idolization morph into a celebrity feud? Celebrity beefs are entertaining to say the least. It's like having two popular kids in high school about to throw down. No doubt, everyone in that school wants to see that fight happen. So, celebrity beef is pretty much the equivalent of that, but on a much, much larger scale. When you get a celebrity beef between two accomplished martial artists, both of whom actually have somewhat legitimate fight records, things become a lot more interesting. And so goes a feud between Jean-Claude Van Damme and Jason David Frank, better known as the Green Power Ranger. So first off, a little history. This feud dates all the way back to 1995 during the premiere of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie.
I will never miss the premiere for a second.
Now there are conflicting reports of what happened. One, Van Damme never actually attended the premiere and Jason David Frank just felt slighted for it. Or two, when the two men did bump into each other at the premiere, Van Damme was less than enthused. So here are the reasons why Van Damme may have actually snubbed the Green Power Ranger. Number one, Jason David Frank is a young, talented, up-and-coming martial artist. The movie industry is very competitive, and a young Van Damme in the peak of his career probably doesn't take too kindly to someone else encroaching on his territory. Number two, Van Damme may not have been in the right mindset. He was dealing with substance abuse problems at the time, and this does alter a person's personality and the way they interact with other people. Also, this was prior to Van Damme being diagnosed with rapid cycling bipolar disorder, which he now takes medication for. And here's a reason why JCVD may not have snubbed the Green Power Ranger. The exchange was probably no big deal for Van Damme, and Jason David Frank unjustifiably just felt slighted.
The day Bison graced your village was the most important day of your life. But for me, it was Tuesday.
Now, regardless of whether or not this was intentional snub or not, Maya Angelou is famously quoted as saying, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." So trying back into how someone makes you feel, although it's often the result of what someone says or does to you, a lot of it comes down to your own interpretation of the event. So in this case, you have Jason David Frank, a young man, probably on top of the world with his success, finally getting to meet his idol, one of the men that helped motivate and push him to achieve what he has. And this man did not provide the sort of recognition that Jason David Frank was looking for. The Green Power Ranger actually said in an interview that he doesn't hold a grudge against Van Damme, only that he should have heeded the age-old advice of never meeting your idols. But regardless of what the Green Power Ranger has said, it certainly seems that he did hold a grudge that continues into this day. In fact, 15 years after that initial snub, Jason David Frank actually challenged Jean-Claude Van Damme to a fight, MMA, or even a kickboxing match. He was quoted as saying, "Anytime, any place, anywhere, and if Van Damme's too scared to come into the octagon, I'll even take him in on a kickboxing match." You gotta remember, this was in 2010, so the fight actually happening wasn't really that far-fetched. This wasn't just a random challenge. This was around the same time Van Damme was shooting a reality show, behind closed doors, and the premise was really focused on leading up into a climax with Van Damme training for a K1 Muay Thai match against former Olympic featherweight boxing champion and Olympic gold medalist Samlak Singh. Although that fight never actually took place and could have likely been a marketing gimmick to get some press for Van Damme's reality show, Jason David Frank seen it as a perfect time to pounce on the opportunity to get himself some press and threw down the gauntlet. The timing for him couldn't be more perfect either. Prior to this gauntlet being thrown down in 2010, on August 21st, 2009, Frank officially announced his signing with Sucker Punch Entertainment. He said there are reasons behind why he wants to fight, that it's a personal thing. It's not about the money or anything else, but rather a promise he made to his brother, who sadly passed away. So Jason David Frank actually did make good on that promise, and in 2010 he actually fought 5 times. He had 4 amateur fights, all wins in the first round, and also a pro fight later in the year, which he also had a win in the first round. Now, since we covered some of Jason David Frank's fighting history, it's only fair to delve into Van Damme's as well. Prior to ever coming to Hollywood, Van Damme actually had a pretty impressive record. Now granted, mixed martial arts was not really a thing back then, but Van Damme did sport the following record. For semi-contact matches, his record was 41-4. But as far as kickboxing goes, 18-1, 18 of those wins by knockout, which he pretty much parlayed into his movie career. One of the things that makes Van Damme movie fights so interesting is that he really brought that powerfulness, that explosiveness, that knockout power to the films. It wasn't like those previous martial arts films where you've seen the guys getting hit 100 times. Van Damme's fights would usually not last nearly as long, and he'd take down many foes with just a couple of kicks or punches to knock them out. He really ushered in a whole new era of action films by putting his own personal spin, no pun intended, on those fights. Now, going back to that challenge in 2010, Frank never heard from Van Damme or his representatives, and perhaps they weren't even aware of the challenge, or probably not even interested if they were. The silence on JCVD's end continued for nearly a decade, that is, until 2017. 7 years after the Green Power Rangers challenge and over 20 since Van Damme apparently snubbed him, the two finally had a run-in at a Comic-Con event in Mexico. And this comes down to a he said, she said type story. The promoter of the Comic-Con contacted Jason David Frank and asked if JCVD could borrow his green room and share it, which Jason obliged, not thinking it was a big deal. Apparently, there was a miscommunication, and Jason David Frank gave up the room in its entirety, as he was blocked from entering it by Van Damme's bodyguards. Rather than get in a tussle over the room, Frank said he found the event promoter and just got another green room so he could rest and catch a bite to eat. So what happened next exactly? Well, it depends who you ask. According to Jason David Frank, everything was cool until he was contacted by a member of Jean-Claude Van Damme's entourage, who said that their star wanted to get a photo with him. Frank obliged, but when he walked into the green room, he saw that multiple people in Jean-Claude's entourage were standing around while someone filmed his entrance with a heavy-duty camera. There was no photo op. Frank claims that it was just a setup. He's quoted as saying, all of his crew comes out and everybody has their cameras out and he has his professional camera. I'm not sure if he's shooting a reality show or what, but all the cameras are on and he comes out of the room and straight up to me and he goes, hey, you like writing articles about people? You want to beat my ass? You gonna apologize for that? And I said, nope. And he goes, you think you can still beat my ass? And I said, yes. So as exchange heated up, Van Damme's entourage surrounded the two men, either expecting to watch a schoolyard brawl or get in on the fight when things got rough. Neither man charged each other initially, and it was only after they both removed their jewelry that a physical altercation took place. According to Jason Frank, Van Damme said, okay, let's do it right now. Jason David Frank thought it was a joke, but the security was filming it, and he apparently thought Van Damme was trying to punk him, either make him look bad or throw a punch first, which would give Van Damme a reason to defend himself. So apparently, according to Jason David Frank, he did put Jean-Claude Van Damme against the wall, put him in a headlock, and Van Damme wanted none of it. Now, that footage has actually never surfaced, so it's hard to say if that actually happened. By now, you think it would have surfaced. Van Damme claims it never has. The footage never surfaced. So for a while, Frank was the only person to actually talk about the scuffle, while Van Damme remained silent. Van Damme actually did finally break his silence on the issue while speaking to Metro later that year in December of 2017, where he claimed that Frank was lying about the whole thing. It never happened. He's saying all this bullshit doesn't exist. Van Damme claims he just wanted to say hello to him in Mexico, and that's about the extent of it. So the two men did meet. There was a face-to-face, some words were exchanged. Whether anything further took place, it's whether you believe this whole grudge, and maybe there's some truth to it, maybe it's not, maybe it's something that's been festering in Jason David Frank's head for the last 25 years, and up until that point, he just thinks Van Damme has it out for him. So with that mindset, maybe Van Damme just wanted to meet and greet him, but Jason David Frank, because of his mindset and what his belief is, that he thought it was just a setup. It's really hard to say. Again, it's a he said type thing. I'm not really saying one of them's right, one of them's wrong. It could have just been a misunderstanding that festered for 20 years and continues to this day. But one of the things that I find interesting, let's break down the fight. So these are both accomplished martial artists. Who do you think would win in a real fight? Now, Jason David Frank is the bigger man. If you just go by their height, Van Damme's around 5'9", Jason David Frank's around 5'11". In their prime, the fight would be pretty amazing. I'd say if it were an MMA or a kickboxing match, realistically, it should be a welterweight fight, 170. With that said, Van Damme and Bloodsport in his prime, probably the mid-180s. He's still in really good shape. He's not as big. I'd say he's probably 170, 170s now. Jason David Frank, quite the opposite. If you look at his build in the early Power Rangers show, 5'11", thin, athletic, probably weighed 170 maybe. Not nearly as muscular as Van Damme. Pretty athletic though. But if you look at his MMA career, he actually fought light heavyweight. Definitely a little out of shape. A lot of the amateur fighters are. He actually did take an amateur fight at heavyweight as well. And against this guy who was 6'5", he got a nice win over him. But realistically, if the fight were to take place, anything can go down on the street. I mean, there could be eye gouges or big groin shots. But if you're talking about like an MMA or even a kickboxing match, Jason David Frank definitely has the age advantage. He still has more youth on the side, though both men are getting up there. Van Damme's 59 right now. Jason David Frank is in his mid-40s. They were both in his prime. It's really hard to say who would win. Depends on the rules. Because if they were both in the prime, Jason David Frank didn't really have the grappling background. He really started training wrestling, and he's got I believe, a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu now, but he didn't really start training that until 2006. So that scuffle in 2017, if it went to the ground, he'd probably have the advantage. If it was a straight-up kickboxing match, it could go either way. Obviously, you're talking about one man with the size advantage, but if they both cut weight, let's say they kept it professional, made a real fight out of it, fought at 170, really hard to say who would win. Who do you guys think would win? Let me know in the comments section. If you think this beef will continue, if they'll make nice, maybe they'll do a movie together someday, who knows. But who do you think would win in their prime or even in a fight right now, based on that data right there that I just provided? So anyway, that's the video, guys. Hope you enjoyed that. I thought it was interesting. Van Damme versus the Green Power Ranger. It's really been going back for 20 years now. If you're interested in this kind of content, hit the like button. Please subscribe to the channel. I'll be covering other things like this as well. And I hope to see you guys next time.